All right, should we get started?
Sure.
All right. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Nadine Heidinger, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Arts Club. I'm thrilled to see that we have over 220 participants signed up and watching right now, so that's absolutely amazing. And thank you again for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Today, we're joined by Christine Coulson, author of the witty and delightful book, Metropolitan Stories, and skilled moderator and host of the Brooklyn-based Page Turners reading series, Glenn Rauscher. And without further ado, let me pass the baton to Glenn. And enjoy the program, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Really appreciate being asked to do this. I'm truly honored. My name is Glenn Rauscher, the host of the Page Turners reading series, formerly the Half King reading series. We know that everyone might be a little zoomed out. We also know there's about 10,000 different Zoom places, in addition to real places you could be on this and any other Tuesday night. And no one involved in putting this event together takes for granted that you've chosen to be here with us. So thank you very, very much for that. In exchange for your presence, your reward is to get to hear from Christine Coulson as she reads from and discusses her incredible book, Metropolitan Stories. We do want you to be part of the conversation. What we ask is that you shape your contribution in the form of a question. And as you look at your Zoom page, you can see the Q&A box. If you could put your Q&A there, I will be looking at that later and interpolating your questions into our conversation. Books are available. Copies of Metropolitan Stories are available from Books on Call NYC. They're selling through bookshop.org, which is a sort of an Etsy-like page for independent booksellers. And we'll also be able to get you book plates signed for this book if you purchase it there. It's normally $23, discounted 10% for all of our attendees tonight. And now we'll move on to our featured author. In Metropolitan Stories, a book about the daily travails of both great art and remarkable people, Christine Coulson writes with sublime specificity and clarity. Whether it be about the physical vanity of an aging curator, or a gorgeous paragraph that likens a table of meticulously arranged name cards to headstones at Arlington National Cemetery and gives the reader the vision instantaneously without taking us out of the moment. There are no words wasted, and her uncanny ability to sum up character and large complex ideas and emotions in taut, explosive prose, getting to the very essence of people, art, and place. Metropolitan Stories vividly points out the foibles and peccadillos of her characters with unsparing precision, but without cruelty. The characters, ones destined to become those we root for and suffer with, and those we'd hope to avoid in real life, all get their full due. She communicates the people and the artworks she brings literally to life, their ache to be seen, heard, and understood. In Metropolitan Stories, Christine Coulson manages the trick of writing with passion and knowledge, with no false sentimentality about her subjects, while still communicating the power and greatness of the art and the wide-ranging experience of her characters. She makes us care deeply for all of it. It's a book that is truly transporting for the characters and for us, the readers, to get lost completely in the stories, to have the music of the language connect equally with head and heart, to laugh out loud, and to be genuinely moved, and to read something unlike anything we've ever read before. Please join me in welcoming Christine Coulson.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. I know you want to start off with a bit of a firecracker of a reading from the book, to give people a taste of some of the tone of the novel. Often in the book, you use very prosaic, everyday tools of modern business to develop character and plot and action. So there are phone calls, and there are emails, and there are meetings, large and small. And of course, there's the ubiquitous memo, which no organization could exist without. There's a particularly vivid scene in the book in the chapter called Night Moves, where a memo is central to the action. Before you read that, can you set that up for us?
Of course. You know, it's interesting that, you know, I worked at the Met for 25 years. And, you know, some people visit the Met once in a while, or for some, once in a lifetime. And I got to live there for those 25 years and spent a lot of time by myself in those galleries every morning, every night, walking through those hallways on my own, often only hearing my own footsteps on those marble floors. And, you know, a different relationship develops when you have that kind of intimacy with a place, and with the people in that place. And it became home, and it became family. And that's what I wanted to write about. I wanted to capture that magic that the public doesn't necessarily see, even though it's right there. And so while this is a novel steeped with all kinds of, I don't love the word magic, but we'll use it anyway, imagination, it's also very much informed by my experiences at the Met and the details and rituals and language and traditions of a place that has evolved over 150 years with its own set of kind of its own language in a way. And this memo that I'm about to read, which I will right here declare is the greatest memo in the history of the Met ever written. And it was one of those things, you know, like in any culture, we are fueled at the Met by gossip and by stories. It's every day in the staff cafeteria of the Metropolitan Museum. It's Thanksgiving dinner, and we are repeating the same tired old stories every day. And part of that is kind of keeping the flame alive on these kind of very mythic stories. And this is one of them. I'd heard this story for years before someone about 10 years ago slipped me this memo, which proved that this actually happened. And so I'm going to read it to you now, and then we can talk a little bit about it. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, Interdepartmental Memorandum. To Richard M. Trackner, Senior Vice President, Operations, from Philip Peterson Little, Chairman, Department of Musical Instruments, April 27th, 1994. While preparing for our benefit concert last evening, members of my department encountered a naked couple engaging in the pursuit of carnal knowledge in a closet of the Uris conference room. Of course, we musicians are used to such indiscretion and indeed applaud this display of youthful enthusiasm. But if this usage is to be encouraged, the closet doors should be equipped with an inside lock to prevent interlopers from being nonplussed, and staff users should be asked to check the day sheet first for possible schedule conflicts. That memo sums up, this book very much takes place in my first 10 years at the Met. I started there in 1994. And so this all takes place in a completely analog world, pre-email time. And the way in which that memo was written, the formality with which it is written, the sort of problem solving that's going on, it's really not, the issue really isn't that people are having sex in the closet. The issue really is that they didn't consult the day sheet first before they chose where to have sex. And that's a very Metropolitan Museum way of approaching things. And so for me as a writer, I have this memo and I don't know who these people are. I never did. I don't know anyone who knows actually who the people are. But then I get to write those characters. I get to write those characters who are going to get themselves into that situation, which then leads to the rest of the story. So it's a nice, that blending of fact and fiction gets woven throughout the book.
One of the things that becomes very, very clear in the book is one of the things that emerges for me is in a sense of belonging. You mentioned the Metropolitan way, and I think it's true with a lot of organizations, but I think the more prestigious organizations, there's a certain frisson of something else. In the meats and cheeses chapter, Kate from the development office says, "These were my people, and I wanted in." How important is that aspect to the characters in the book?
Oh, it's fundamental to the institution. I think that, you know, the Met is very tribal, and, you know, this book is written from 16 perspectives. So it's 16 vignettes told from different points of view. And the reason why it's a novel and not a collection of stories is that you have to read them in order. So as you read, you aggregate knowledge, and characters repeat, and information that you have becomes relevant later on. I mean, I was very pleased when you said that the language had been pruned down to its very essence. That's something I worked really hard at, as well as this kind of overriding structure of what you're going to know when, and when those things are going to be useful later on. That whole structure was really important to me. But you're right, the through line really is a kind of fundamental devotion that everyone in this book has to that place. And that runs from the director, who kind of embodies the museum, to the curators, but also to the guys who change the light bulbs, and the guy who sweeps the front steps. And so that full scope of the Met's endeavor, and we think about, you know, there's 2,200 employees at the museum. And so, and there's only 102 curators. So the rest of them are doing different things, and it's its own little empire. You know, the Met outsources nothing. We have our own plumbers, our own electricians. You need something made of plexiglass, we have a plexi shop. Everything is done in-house. And so it functions as this little city. And I wanted to reveal that, but also I wanted to reveal that the underpinning of all of that is that devotion. And that is the thing that goes largely unspoken, but that connects us all, no matter what our role is in the larger museum.
You mentioned it really interesting. You mentioned it's like a little city. And one of the other things that comes up in the book for me is the idea of sort of class and strata, and how people pass sort of in and out of those worlds, both while doing their jobs, but also when they leave. How important was it to show sort of the various levels of the city that you build in the book that may also mirror the Met as you actually know it?
I think it came out, that kind of comes out naturally in the way that I think about the place. And I think the other important thing to note here, and the character that we haven't brought into this conversation yet, is the art. And it's important to note that, you know, in this book, I'm really dealing with two collections. The works of art, which I give human characteristics to. The second chapter is written from the perspective of an 18th century chair. And the staff, which I treat as kind of exquisite works of art. And there's very little barrier between those two groups. And so I put them in that hierarchy as well. You know, in the opening lines of the book, I mean, I really give away the biggest through line, which is that we, the staff, think we're protecting and saving the works of art, when the truth is the works of art are protecting and saving us. And I think that's a very big reason why people don't leave, why they are so dedicated to that place. And I think when we talk about any kind of hierarchy within the museum, that connective tissue, that need to be there, that need to be with those objects and feed off of them and from them. That's the thing that links us all and kind of flattens that hierarchy.
I don't want to give, I don't want to spoil the experience of people coming to understand from their own reading what happens with the art. How did you conceive of the personifying of the art and how it comes to life? And what were some of the challenges for you in doing that?
You know, I think that I didn't know how to write it any other way. So I think that there's a challenge in suddenly giving an object human characteristics, but at the same time, that's the way I feel about them. That's the way I kind of think about objects. I think of them as witnesses to history. I often love the collapse of time you can have looking at, you know, a 4,000-year-old Egyptian statue or an 18th century chair or a Renaissance statue. When you stop and think about what that object has seen, when you slow down and think about who sat in that chair and who buried that object and who looked at that object, I think there's a sense of the continuity of humanity, and the beauty of survival in looking at these objects often gets a little distorted by the museum experience and the distance we put between the viewer and the work of art and the lighting and the cases, and we make it all very, very special and extraordinary. And we forget that these objects have had their own path to that point. And I often love to think about even an object's time in storage and what that must have been like. The loneliness of storage is something I really am captivated by. So for me, I didn't, as you know, it's one of the challenges I have with the word magic. I didn't, those parts of the book where I write from the perspective of the work of art, to me, they're almost the most realistic because that's how I think about them. And so it was sort of liberating, having written for the Met for 25 years, often in an institutional voice or ghostwriting for curators, I was a speechwriter for 8 years, to then sit down and write this book and to tell that story in my own voice and in my own way was great fun. And I think that's why it came pouring out of me.
You mentioned this sort of the distancing that people sometimes might feel like they would experience going into a place like that. Did you feel it was important in the book to sort of break down the presentational part, although you talk about how the art is presented in the book, but it is very much a developed character. Did you think about, was it important to you to think about how to break down that particular barrier that maybe people who've never been to the museum because they feel it's not for them might feel it's an impediment to really having an emotional response to the work?
I felt like it was important to be true to a couple of things, that I never mess with the entire book takes place within the 4-block long, 2-block deep museum building. And I'm very faithful to the geography of that building and how it operates and where you find things. I never put something where it isn't. I never say we have a work of art that we don't have. I was very faithful to the collection and the physicality of the museum, partially because I think while the reader doesn't necessarily know whether that's accurate or not, I think you feel that. And so when I do take those leaps of imagination, I think you're ready for it because the factual stuff has laid the foundation for you to do that. At the same time, I had to make a fundamental decision about whether I was going to explain who Caravaggio was. And so there are moments in the book where I throw out all kinds of references to Bernini or whatever, and they're very fast. And I just decided I'm not going to do that, except when it matters. Except when you need to know, because that character really comes from that point of information. So there's lots of references to works of art and to isms and things that I don't really stop to explain because I felt like it would slow down the narrative.
And I think that's right. In my experience reading it, if it would have become academic, we would have lost the characters a little bit. And I feel that it's okay to have a little bit of mystery, because it actually, in the experience of reading it, felt like it made me want to go deeper. Because I assumed, because you'd set it up that way, that the characters would then tell me what I needed to know.
Right, you'll get what you need to know.
Yeah.
And now we've just launched a website that has every work of art referenced in the book, and you can click through to the Met's website and see them all. So we'll connect everybody to that. So it's kind of a reader companion, but I don't think you need that to read the book. I hope you don't.
I don't think you do at all. Just for everyone watching and listening, again, a second welcome to you. If you're obviously watching and participating here on Zoom, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. It is being monitored more or less continually. So if you've got a question you want to throw out, please let us know. A question that comes from Ashley Smith. There are so many amazing pieces at the Met. How did you choose the art and objects that you wrote about? And I think it's related to your last answer.
Yeah, well, I think it's important. The works of art in this book are not on anyone's masterpiece list, for sure. These are the works of art that I would go to over my time there. And, you know, a big part of my job early in my career, I was an assistant. I was sort of the lowest of the low of the low on the totem pole when I started at the Met in 1994. And a big part of my job was often to deliver what we call cheeses, which are, you know, as you said, it's the mundane stuff of office work, the same interoffice memos, like the envelopes that everyone else has. They're the yellow things with holes in them. And we at the Met, I guess because we're visual people and they look like cheese, we call them cheeses. And cheese was a noun, cheese is a verb, you can cheese someone a cheese, and a lot of my time was spent delivering cheeses to very intimidating people and waiting for them to sign them and bring them back. And in the course of that, you know, I really grew to kind of own the museum because I understood how to get kind of up and down and across and over and through the public spaces, then behind a secret door to get to the basement and then wrap around and move through the museum in a way that was really efficient, but that also brought me to the galleries when I wanted them to take a break and look at the objects that really spoke to me. And those are the objects that wound up here. The objects that I would slow down for, that when I had time in the galleries at night, that I would take the longer route to go and visit, and that really connect to me. And they tend not to be the great masterpieces of the museum. They tend to be things that either soothe me or inspire me or make me think in some way. And, you know, and there are objects that are based in Met history. One of the sculptures that I write from is, I write from the perspective of a marble statue of Adam. One of the great tragedies in my time at the Met was when an early Renaissance marble of Adam fell from its pedestal and broke one Sunday night in 2002. And it was like a death. And it was something that we all experienced as a community. It was treated like a crime scene. The floor was gridded where the statue fell, and in each square, the kind of dust and particles that were in that square were collected in little Ziploc bags. And Adam was rebuilt over the course of 11 years. And in 2013, Adam was reemerged as a fully repaired, extraordinary sculpture. And it was a great triumph for the museum. But in that moment when Adam had fallen, I remember thinking, and maybe this says something about my own imagination, I really wondered what it felt like when the sculpture was in the air. You know, that moment, not when it hit the ground, but with the moment when this thing that is never supposed to move was suddenly moving through the air. And maybe that was kind of a relief for that statue. It's been standing there for 300 years. So one of the first things I wrote were those 2 paragraphs about what that sculpture felt like in the air. And I think that was a work of art that I never really went to visit until he was rebuilt. And then I had a connection to him that was really based on trying to think about that experience, the experience of being in 1,000 pieces and the experience of being put back together. And what a metaphor for so many things.
I don't want to give away too much more of that chapter.
I know we can't.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I assume was a challenge is you're dealing, of course, with artworks famous and not famous in the book, but you're also creating a world of humans. How did you go about making sure from the conception of the book, from knowing that you were going to incorporate personified artworks, how did you maintain the balance where your human art that you were creating out of whole cloth, from whatever truth or fiction that actually happened, how did you make sure that they held their own with the art that you were also depicting throughout the book?
I think it's a great cliche, but it does hold up that, characters kind of find themselves. I mean, I often start with the traits of a person who existed in the museum. It's not going to be a great shock to anyone to read the chapter about the director of the Met and to start to see some vague resemblance to the legendary Philippe de Montebello, a great hero of mine, and certainly the director during the period in which this book takes place. But to just write a kind of alternate character for Philippe wouldn't hold up. And so while that character emerges from ideas about a director who is French and both revered and adored and incredibly intimidating, and who embodies the institution, those are certainly all characteristics that Michel Larousse, who is the director in the book, shares with Philippe de Montebello. But then the character has to kind of find its own legs. And if it doesn't, it just won't work. And so often I would start with a character and then see where they traveled. And it surprised me a lot of the times. But, and again, not giving anything away, but there's only one member of the public that I write about, Melvin. And Melvin came from wanting to write about the front steps of the museum and the spectacle of that iconic place and the experience of sort of looking out from the museum into New York and what you can see there. And from that came a character who I'm surprised, but everybody loves, and I think everybody identifies with, and his interaction with a custodian from the museum, who again, is, I love the guys who clean the Met. I just think their relationship to the place and to the works of art is as intimate as any curator.
One of the things that I think you accomplished in the book really well, and I think the book would have sunk if it was just a serious drama the whole way, is a balance of high and low. The memo is a perfect example of maybe a little bit of both, actually. But how conscious were you of making sure there was a balance between high and low, serious and funny, and of course the delicious times where they cross? How conscious of you were?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes out because that's sort of the way I feel about the museum, that it is, on one hand, this extraordinary collection of very peculiar characters who I love and who I feel a great connection to. And I'm very dedicated to them as human beings, and they made for great characters. But at the same time, there is this bigger thing that the museum represents in my mind. And there is a kind of constancy to that. You know, it's the closest thing I have to religion, is that place and what it represents. And so I don't think that could help but come through in the writing. And the way that I think about objects is very much informed by that larger thinking about survival and about the persistence of beauty and why we need it. And I think that naturally comes through in the writing, because it's how I feel about the institution. You know, at the same time, you know, there are all these people in the museum. You know, we think about the last story in the book, and again, we're not going to give anything away, but it's based on a guy who did exist, that I call the Rubberband Man, because he had this long ponytail with all these rubber bands wrapped around it. And I never saw him anywhere but in the basement, in the same place in the basement, for 25 years. And he's a character who represents that kind of anonymous devotion. He's a guy who, within that empire, his job, and that empire gives rise to many an obscure job, his job was to organize the Met shopping bags for the stores. So the little red ones and the medium blue ones and the big yellow ones, that was his job. And he did it diligently and with great devotion for many years. And so when I needed a character, because I kind of needed someone, again, I'm not giving anything away, but I needed someone to die, because I wanted to write about how the Met mourns, because that to me is our sort of most tribal self, comes out in the traditions and rituals that we invoke when someone dies. And so I wanted to write about that. And so that's a great moment of kind of high and low. And I needed a character. I had to kill someone. And I did kill him, and I was very sad about it. And then interestingly, you know, the Met gave me a sabbatical to write this book. I was, took the year 2017, I was on sabbatical for a year and wrote the novel. And during that time, that man in the basement retired. And so after I killed him, I never saw him again. And so.
Wow.
But he's alive and well, and I've gotten him a copy of the book, so.
And what did he say?
I don't know.
Oh,
I just found someone who knew him, and I said,
okay.
oh, I signed a copy for him.
And
He lived a very lovely life in the book, so.
I mean, he was gainfully employed for close to 70 years at one place.
Exactly.
We should all be that lucky.
There's a little poetic license.
That's all right. That's what makes the book. Again, I want to just let everybody know that if you've got a question, and we do want the questions to sort of not be so much about the Met, although those are great questions, but actually about the book, the writing, the author, the process. That's what sort of I'm going to be pulling forward from the Q&A. So please throw your questions into the Q&A. What was the biggest challenge you faced in writing the book? What was the biggest problem you encountered, and how did you overcome it?
The biggest challenge was structure. Because I was writing it in these little sort of packets. I was writing, and it comes from speech writing. You never write a speech from the beginning to the end. You always start in the middle. You start with the sort of point you want to make, and then it sort of spreads like a ink blot or something. So as I was writing, and I didn't keep a journal over all those years. So for 23 years, I kind of just thought about these things. Something would happen, and I would think about it, and it never let it go. You know, one great example is at the beginning of the story of the director. There's a memo that I delivered in 1996 to Philippe de Montebello. And it was a briefing memo for a meeting he was going to have with Karl Lagerfeld. And again, this is something I never had to write down because I just remembered it so well. The memo actually said, Mr. Lagerfeld will bring his muse. The muse will not speak. Do not address the muse. And so in that moment, it's 1996, and I read this and I think that's funny. And I think, well, what if the director brought his own muse to the meeting, and there was like a muse showdown? And so it's 23 years later when I'm writing, I think of that, and I'm writing that story about the director searching for a muse from the collection. But that can't just sit there in isolation. So how does that then link to everything else? So who is that character of the director, and how does he function throughout the rest of the book? And so much of what I did after I wrote most of it was a kind of really brutal pruning to get it to where it is now, where everything's at its essence and everything has a role to play, even if you don't realize it. It's all that linking. It's that classic, was it Mark Twain who said, I would have written less, but I didn't have enough time. That the sort of time-consuming thing, the big challenge is really, and pages and pages of my own writing just left in the dust to get to just what you need in order to have this experience. And I wanted the book to be a kind of experience, because it was unorthodox, because it wasn't a kind of traditional novel where we lose the Vermeer and we find the Vermeer, that we were going to do something different. And on that path, I needed to make sure you felt like you were in good hands.
There's a section, if you don't mind, and please say no if you do, I'd love to hear, one of the things, I'll set this up, one of the things that this is also, in a way, as I read it, is these are all, mostly at least, New Yorkers who are working in the Met, and the Met is in New York, and there's a lovely, briefish passage from the front steps. I was wondering if you might read from page 123, where Melvin is on the front steps.
Yeah.
And it's just a cinematographic view of New York from the steps.
Okay.
And I think
I know
that
what
also,
you're talking about. Yeah.
it also gets across some of the theme about the importance of the people. So I'd love to hear you read that if you don't mind.
So this is Melvin, the guy we talked about before. Melvin has lost his job, and he's sitting on the steps of the Met because he's too ashamed to admit that he's lost his job. And it's a very New York thing. The main people he's worried about knowing he lost his job are his doormen. So he keeps up the ritual of leaving his apartment building at the same time every day. And he goes to sit on the steps of the Met. And there's this is the passage of what he's looking at. As Melvin waited for the Met to open to the public, he watched the looping activity on the museum's plaza. A food vendor scooping stagnant water from the oblong fountain for cooking his hot dogs, his curbside cart covered in American flags and labeled disabled veteran. Mean girls in shrunken school uniforms with bare cultish legs, gossiping and spitting gum onto the ground before entering the Marymount School across Fifth Avenue. A Wall Street banker stepping his expensive English shoe into one of the sticky pink wads and pulling it along with him to the cab stand at 82nd Street. The awkward ending of a date that had started the night before. He, hungover and evasive, she, eager and overdressed. The strange proximity of two rats humping nearby, one mounted atop the other, aping the couple's unbridled fucking just hours earlier. Excited tourists clocked to the wrong time zone, too early for the Met, but elated by the sight of genuine New York City rats. A bike messenger, spandex like a superhero, on a stripped bike, mummified in duct tape, whipping down the avenue and then leaping over the curb to escape the path of a cab, stopping to pick up the Wall Street banker. A homeless man dragging a tall wooden cross south toward the park entrance, along with a cardboard sign that read, "He is coming. Are you ready?" A goth high school student handing the homeless man a cigarette when asked if one could be spared. And then the careful acrobatics of balancing cross, sign, and cigarette simultaneously, a challenge never faced by Jesus. A Park Avenue matron clad in quilted jacket, Belgian loafers, and cauliflower hair, competing with her greyhound for minimum weight and maximum elegance. An elderly man, lumpen and stiff, clutching his walker and dragging himself forward as if toward death itself, his nurse beside him, seeming to ignore the slow and incontinent subject of her toil. And Walter, his crisp silhouette outlined in the late September sun, carefully sweeping as if the plaza were his own front porch.
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Question from Layla. Thank you, Layla, very much for asking. What was your writing style like when you were on the sabbatical? Did you close yourself off from the world, or just and write nonstop, or did you wander and then write when the mood struck you?
I was very, very disciplined. There's something great about a deadline, and I had a year, and I knew I only had a year, and I wrote this book in exactly a year. And I had never, I had my entire working life, I had gone to the Met every single day, and I had my rituals there, and I essentially replicated them in a way during my sabbatical. I ate the same breakfast at the same place on the same stool every single day. I walked the same path. I wrote most of it at the New York Public Library. I had a residency there. I sat in the same chair. I'm very ritualistic and almost superstitious in that way. I wrote for the same hours every single day. I do not leave the chair. No breaks, no coffee breaks, no snacks. You just sit there, and some days it comes and some days it doesn't. And eventually it's word by word, paragraph by paragraph. But I'm really, really disciplined, and it's the only way I know how to do it, is to just go into that hole. And I really stayed away from the museum. I stayed away from the work of the Met, the gossip of the Met, all of that stuff. I really wanted to write about the works of art, not in front of them, actually. I find writing about art from memory actually reveals to you what you think is important about it. And then I would go back later and sort of fact check. I always got scale wrong. Things that I always got the size sort of off, but I find it really interesting when you're writing about something from memory. What's important to you is what pushes forward, and the rest recedes. And so often things are built around very obscure details, but that are persistent in my imagination. But it was all discipline.
You had a year. You took a year.
I had a year, and I finished it.
So a question from anonymous attendee.
Mm-hmm.
Strange name. Does the Met have an official position on the novel? The question he asks is if there's a link to the art you mentioned, the person, he or she, suggests they imagine they must approve of the work.
Oh, the Met has been incredibly supportive, and I don't think they ever were concerned about that. I think that the reason they gave me the sabbatical was one of supporting someone who had been devoted to them and still is. I don't think they ever worried that I was going to write some kind of tell-all. I wouldn't do it, and I wasn't interested in that. And so no one read it before it was published. They didn't ask to, and I think they knew it was going to be a love letter to the place and to the people. I delivered the first copy I received to Philippe de Montebello at his home, and he took 3 weeks to get back to me.
God.
Which nearly killed me, but he was great about it. And so I've had great support from the museum. I speak at the museum. When it was open, I did a lot of talks there for their patrons and as part of their lecture series. So it's been a delight, and I think I think it's a nice thing, particularly now that the museum is closed. It's kind of a nice way to visit. And I think a lot about those works of art being in those darkened galleries now. And I think this is a way to kind of access what might be going on in these unprecedented times.
Lisa Ferber asks sort of a follow-up of that. Were you concerned at all about revealing too much about the people or inner workings of the Met?
No, I mean, I was very, I don't know, I'm so respectful of that place. I wouldn't, I'm sure, I think the publishing industry really wanted me to write like the Devil Wears Prada Museum Edition. And I'm not really capable of writing that, but those are not my stories to tell. So what I chose here were details and characters that I have great affection for. I think there's a great discussion that I am very amused by among the curators about who the curator is in the chapter called The Talent. And I am very consistent in my answer that it is not one curator, it's all of their worst qualities combined. I love the curators. I think the reason that chapter is called The Talent is because I do believe in the hierarchy that you mentioned earlier. The curators are right at the top of that. We simply could not do what we do without those eyes and minds behind it. They are like the dancers at the ballet. They are the people. I was infinitely replaceable throughout my entire career, and those curators are not. And so I adore them and loved working with them, but they're also complicated and kind of a pain in the ass sometimes, and that's what makes great creative people great creative people.
It's funny because I wanted to ask a little bit about that in terms of, we meet Nick, what I would refer to, I think, politely as the nervous curator. And he would so easily be a vessel for contempt and mocking. But despite you continually sort of puncturing his pretensions and self-aggrandizement, he never crosses over into being purely unlikable. And I wanted to ask, how did you strike that balance with him and with other characters? And especially, I think Nick is certainly the toughest one, because it would be so easy to have him be the one character in the book that you just let all the negativity out on.
Well, I think all of Nick's worst qualities come from the best place. I mean, Nick is neurotic and tedious and annoying because he cares so much. Yeah. And so when Nick finally has his moment in the galleries and it's only him alone with those works of art, and you understand where that magic is. I mean, and the curators are really the only people in the book who don't need the magic of the work. They have a different relationship with those objects. But the beauty of that moment that Nick has with those objects actually wipes away all that annoying stuff. And I think that's about right. I mean, that's sort of the way they are. And it's worth it. I think a lot of creative people are like that. They're hard work because they're so invested in the work. And so I think I'm very sympathetic to that.
He in the end, I think the thing that you communicate is you understand him. I felt like that chapter could have been a real tightrope, and it wound up like I didn't dislike Nick. I almost wanted to protect him from himself a little bit.
I know, he's lovable, and you do. I mean, I think that's the thing about, often, it's not the interaction that matters. It's what we're all trying to achieve. And right. So where that gets complicated in meetings or in the staff cafeteria or wherever, well, that's fine, because at the end of the day, and I think this is one of the things that comes out in why it doesn't cross into that line, because that history we have with one another, the fact that we all stay there for so long and that we are so connected. I mean, I worked with curators there who knew me from the first day I showed up. And when you build that history over time, there's a trust there and a belief in what they're doing and my support of it that underpinned all those conversations. And we didn't have to talk about it, but they knew in the most contentious moments that I was on their team. I was on their side, and I would do the right thing for them because I believed in what they believed in. And so I think where that gets messy is just character. That's fun to write because, they're not flawless.
Yeah, it would be a very, very tiresome book if they were all
right.
Same with the art as well, because you do also show the art in its fullness as well. So Catherine Smith wants to know, you talked about your year sabbatical. Was it hard at all to return after a year away, or was it just right back as things were for you?
No, I was surprised. I was surprised during the sabbatical on a couple things. I was surprised that I liked being alone so much. I actually really did very well with that. What I missed about the museum was the physical building. I missed the space. I missed the objects. The people I saw, I would see the people for drinks or wherever, and we would connect in a different way. But I missed, after about 3 months, I really had to just go and be with the building a little bit. I remember passing by the building at night and giving it sort of pats to just say, I haven't gone, I'm just not here now. But I didn't, going back, it was different. But I was actually, when I returned, I had probably the best job I ever had there, which was an amazing opportunity to write for the new British galleries that were just opened this past, I guess, January. And that was an incredible experience working with those curators. And so part of it, the return, was that I had such a juicy project that, and it was a different kind of writing, but it was equally as intense, and it had all the challenges of writing the novel in a different way. And it was incredibly collaborative with a great group of curators. So I had this really meaty thing to do. So it was an easy transition to go back.
I want to pull a question off from our viewers really quickly. From, again, anonymous attendee, I assume a different one. Going all the way back, so you had your sabbatical, you came back. Now I want to go all the way back to the other side of your work at the Met. Why did you want to work there? Did you study art history?
I did study art history, and I spent a lot of time at the museum, but it wasn't until 1991, I did an internship between undergraduate and graduate school. I was an intern in European paintings and had the most amazing experience. My job was to sort through the correspondence between Louisine Havemeyer, the great American collector and suffragette, and the great American Impressionist painter, Mary Cassatt. And so they had this correspondence, and the museum received this box of their letters, these beautifully folded, closed with sealing wax correspondence between them. And we were working on the Havemeyer exhibition, and the curator who was writing the catalog basically needed me to go through these letters, read them, and sort of catalog what was in each letter. And I was given, because I needed space, I was given the office of a very senior curator who was on sabbatical. And so there I am in this very grand office doing this beautiful work, so inspiring, so physical. I'm behind the velvet rope now. I've got access to all those inner workings of the Met, and I just thought, sign me up. This is it. I'm done. So I went off to graduate school, and then after graduate school, I came back. And ironically, I came back as an assistant, and all of that was gone. I literally sat on a stool and shared a desk with 2 other people. But that didn't go away. That magic of being a part of that, it will never go away. I left the museum last April to write another book, because I'm not the kind of person, because I do write the way that I do. I can't work there all day and then come home and write until 3 in the morning. So as another book started to bubble up, I did slightly, toward the end of the British Galleries project, feel like every word I was writing for them was a word I could be writing for me. And that seemed like, it was almost exactly, it was a little longer than 25 years. And it just seemed like it's time to leave home. It's time to go do this other thing. And so, but without losing any of my access. I still have my ID. Still have my
It was from the Met here. You didn't hear that. So before I go to the last question, which I was going to follow up something you just said there, I do want to, again, do a couple things. Remind people that the book is available through Books on Call NYC's bookshop.org. The link should be in the chat. You can always contact anybody involved here, including the National Arts Club, to get that link, or you can email booksonCallNYC@gmail.com for information about the bookshop.org, but go to bookshop.org, look for Books on Call. And again, to thank everybody for participating. I'm going to ask one more question, then give it back to Nadine to wrap it up. So you mentioned that you said about a year ago, you started on another book. And we do have someone who asked, what are you working on now, and what do you look forward to?
Well, I did start what I call the sort of post-it note phase of the next book, which is the fun part. I haven't started writing it yet, mainly because in the fall I was touring for this book all around the country, so I can't write in that mode. But and I also this is proved by the fact that I waited 23 years to write the first book. I do kind of believe once you have that spark of an idea and kind of withholding a little bit, not writing it down and letting it cook a while. I mean, it's one of those things that I go and visit in my mind every once in a while to sort of see how it's doing. And it's amazing what comes out of that. And so I think the process of not writing is sometimes the first phase of writing. And so I'm kind of at that point, and we're all in a moment now where things are kind of thrown off their usual calendar. So whereas I thought I would begin really writing in earnest in that same ritualistic schedule at the end of the tour, which was ending in May, and I would start writing in earnest in June. We'll see how that goes. But I feel like it's there, it's happening. It's not, it's basically a single sentence in this book made into a novel. So if you guess the sentence, I'll tell you you're right.
Which means everyone's going to have to read all 200 plus pages of this and then guess the sentence, but read it first.
And I'm going to read one last thing.
Great.
Because I think it's important for right now, because we just talked about this bizarre moment we're in. And I think while the museum is closed, it's interesting to think about it from this perspective. So the opening chapter of the book is called We, and it is about the staff and identifies who we are and how we think about the works of art. And after I wrote that, my very challenging editor said, well, that's great. Now I want you to write the same thing from the perspective of the works of art and how they feel about you. And so I wrote this, and I'm just going to read this quick passage before we end, because I think it's important to think about right now. Survival is a funny business too, a losing game, literally. They love us and we lose them all. The ones who made us, the ones who gave us, the ones who sat down and played with us, the ones who held us or just laid eyes on us, the ones who bought, traded, and sold us, cleaned us, redeemed us, brought back the sheen on us, loved us, learned everything there is to know about us. Imagine how many reflections that ancient mirror has seen. Now imagine every one of them dead, gone. But we live on. We are the proof, sticky but silent, hanging on that wall, standing on that pedestal, the proof that anyone was ever there at all.
Christine, thank you for this beautiful book. Thank you for doing this. And thank everybody for participating. I want to give it back to Nadine to wrap things up. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.